So, um, I want to start today by asking you to visualize something. If you're not driving right now, maybe just close your eyes for a second. Picture a standard world map.
Oh, like the ones hanging in every high school geography classroom?
Exactly. You know the one.
Hmm.
Pastel colors, the big blue oceans, and crucially, those thick black lines outlining every single country.
Right, the lines that basically tell us where here ends and there begins.
Yeah, we grow up looking at those lines and, we subconsciously treat them as permanent, like they were carved into the Earth's crust by some cosmic Sharpie or something.
It's comforting, honestly.
It is. We think of a state, a country, as this solid, immovable concrete block. France is France. Brazil is Brazil. End of story.
It implies that the world is finished and, completely sorted out.
But that's the illusion, right? Because
Yeah.
if you look at a map from, say, 1990 or 1950 or definitely 1910, those lines are dancing. They move, they fade, and sometimes they just shatter completely. A country isn't a solid block. It's much more like a fragile balancing act. And when that balance gets thrown off, things start to crack.
That is the perfect way to frame this deep dive. We are jumping right into the mechanics of that fragility. Specifically, we're exploring a concept from the source material called devolution.
Devolution.
Yeah.
It's a heavy word. And I think for a lot of people, it just sounds like the opposite of evolution. We're making about society regressing back to the Stone Age.
Not quite, though I imagine for a central government losing its power, it can certainly feel like a regression.
Fair enough.
In political geography, devolution is strictly defined as the transfer of power from a central government, usually the capital city, outwards to regional or subnational units. So think provinces, states, or territories.
Okay, so it's the center basically loosening its grip.
Precisely. It's a shift that weakens the center and strengthens the local level. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the why. Why do countries crack apart? Why do some regions get their own parliaments and their own laws, while others just break away entirely to become totally new nations?
Right, and we have a whole stack of research here breaking down what we're calling the factors of state fragmentation. And what's wild to me is that these aren't just one single thing. It's this messy mix of geography, money, identity, and sometimes, unfortunately, violence.
Yeah. But before we get into those specific factors, I need to set the stage with a little bit of theory. The sources note that geographers often talk about two opposing forces acting on a country at any given time.
Okay.
First, you have centripetal forces. These are things like a shared language or a really strong leader, things that pull a country together.
Centripetal, right. And then you have the opposites, centrifugal forces.
Yeah, exactly. Like a centrifuge spinning way too fast. These are the forces pulling the country apart. Devolution happens when those pulling apart forces get so strong that the central government just can't ignore them anymore. They have to do something to relieve the pressure.
So let's look at the actual mechanism of that relief. When we say transfer of power, how does that manifest in the real world? Are we talking about a violent revolution? People storming the palace gates?
Surprisingly, usually not. Devolution is very often the alternative to a revolution. It's highly bureaucratic.
So paperwork, not gunpowder.
Right. The sources mention mechanisms like constitutional changes, the creation of new regional parliaments, or signing very specific autonomy agreements.
Reading through the mechanics here, it actually reminds me a lot of negotiating with a rebellious teenager.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Think about the dynamic. The kid wants total freedom. They want to move out. They absolutely hate your rules. As a parent, you essentially have two choices. You can try to lock them in their room and impose martial law.
Which pretty much guarantees they'll resent you and run away the first chance they get.
Exactly. Or you negotiate. You say, okay, look, here are the car keys. You can take the car, and your curfew is now midnight instead of 10 p.m. You are technically devolving your parental authority.
You're losing control over where they are.
Right, but you're doing it to keep them in the house. You give up a little power to maintain the overall relationship.
That is a really solid analogy. And to stretch it just a bit further, the state is essentially betting that the car keys are enough. The hope is that by granting that limited autonomy, the teenager feels respected enough to just stay part of the family.
But the risk is that they take the car keys and just keep driving.
And that is the ultimate risk. The source material highlights a whole range of outcomes. It can start with just granting limited self-governance, the car keys. But if that fails, or if the initial pressure is just too high, it leads to what they call total fragmentation.
Which is the kid moving out, changing their name, and blocking your number.
Exactly. That's a brand new independent nation.
Okay, so let's get into the specific pressures that force this hand. What makes the kid want to leave in the first place? The first factor in our research stack is quite literally the ground beneath our feet, physical geography.
Right. Geography is often destiny. If you can't reach a region, you really can't rule it effectively. This brings us to a key term from the research, the friction of distance.
Friction of distance. It sounds like a physics term.
It basically is, but in this context, it's about political control. The principle is simple. The greater the distance between two locations, the weaker the connection.
Makes sense.
If a capital city is separated from a remote province by massive distances or just terrible infrastructure, maintaining national unity becomes incredibly difficult. The friction literally eats away at the government's power.
So by the time an order from the capital reaches the frontier, it's basically a whisper.
Yes.
And we aren't just talking about miles on a map here. The sources emphasize physical barriers, mountains, rivers, islands, the kind of stuff that makes travel and, more importantly, enforcement an absolute nightmare.
Exactly. Because physical isolation allows unique cultures to incubate. If a group of people is cut off by a mountain range for 1,000 years, they're going to develop their own language, their own customs, completely independent of whatever the capital is doing.
The classic example in the notes here is the Basques in Spain.
Yes, the Basque region is the textbook example of this. They are physically separated from the rest of Spain by the Pyrenees Mountains. That mountain range acted as a massive cultural shield.
Wow.
Because of that physical wall, they preserved a language that is linguistically baffling to outsiders. It is completely unrelated to Spanish or French or really any other Indo-European language.
That's fascinating. So while the rest of the Iberian Peninsula was getting Romanized and mixing cultures, the Basques were just up in the mountains doing their own thing.
For centuries, and that extreme isolation created a fierce sense of distinct identity, the feeling of we are not Spanish, we are Basque. And eventually, that identity turned into intense political pressure.
They pushed for independence.
They pushed for decades. Ultimately, in the 1978 Spanish Constitution, the central government had to grant them status as an autonomous region. That is devolution in action, triggered directly by the geography of the Pyrenees.
The notes also mention Nepal and Switzerland here as similar examples.
Similar dynamic, just on a different scale. You have extremely mountainous terrain. In Switzerland, you have these deep, isolated valleys that cut communities off from one another.
So it's hard to have one single culture.
Very hard. It's nearly impossible to have a uniform culture when everyone is living in isolated pockets. So instead of trying to force a top-down unity from a strong center, Switzerland developed the canton system.
Which is highly devolved.
Very much so. Autonomous states within a state.
So mountains literally shaped the government structure.
They demanded it. You just can't run a highly centralized empire when you can't even get your tax collectors over the mountain pass in winter.
Okay, so that's the physical side of things. But let's pivot to the human geography. Because sometimes, even if the land is totally flat, the people are just different. This brings us to factor number 2, identity and society, specifically ethnic separatism.
This is a huge driver, and probably the most emotional one we'll cover. Ethnic separatism is what happens when people care more about their tribe or their ethnic group than their passport.
We see this all over the news constantly. But how do the sources define it technically?
The definition here is prioritizing ethnic identity over national identity. It is very often linked to territoriality.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the feeling that this specific land belongs to my people, not to your government. It's a fundamental rejection of the idea that the lines drawn on the map accurately represent who we are.
The source material brings up Sudan as a major example of this. And honestly, this feels like a case where the map lines were drawn by people who had never even been there.
Tragically, yes. Sudan is a stark example of colonial borders completely ignoring human reality. You had a legacy of British colonialism that lumped incredibly distinct groups together within one rectangular border.
Just force them in.
Right. You had a sharp division between the north, which was predominantly Arab and Muslim, and the south, which was largely Black, African, and Christian or animist.
Two totally different civilizations just forced to share a kitchen.
And the kitchen caught fire. They weren't just culturally different. They ended up fighting brutal civil wars over it for decades. The South identified as ethnically and culturally distinct from the northern-dominated government in Khartoum.
So simple devolution wasn't going to fix that.
No. The pressure was so immense that granting some basic autonomy wasn't enough. They went all the way to the moving out phase.
Total fragmentation.
They did. That's how we got the independent state of South Sudan in 2011. The centrifugal forces of identity literally tore the country in half.
The notes also mention the Kurds in Iraq and Turkey, and Catalonia in Spain again. It really seems like Spain is the poster child for this kind of fragmentation.
Spain is a very devolved state precisely because it has so many distinct regional identities. Catalonia is interesting because it pops up in almost every category we're discussing. They have the distinct ethnic identity, they have their own language, Catalan, but as we'll see in a minute, they have other massive reasons to want out too.
Actually, before we move on to the money side of things, I want to touch on the social problems aspect of identity. It isn't always about ancient tribal bloodlines. Sometimes it's literally just language.
Yes.
The notes highlight Belgium.
Mm.
Now, Belgium is a highly developed, wealthy European state. You wouldn't normally think of it as fragile.
You wouldn't, but it is deeply fractured internally. It is split almost right down the middle. You have the north, Flanders, where they speak Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch, and you have the south, Wallonia, where they speak French.
And these aren't just dialects like an American accent versus a British accent. These are fundamentally different languages.
Completely different. And the research points out that these groups identify with their language group much more than they identify with the concept of Belgium. There are separate political parties, separate media ecosystems, separate schools.
So you have a country where half the population literally cannot understand the other half.
Effectively, yes. And as you can imagine, it causes persistent political gridlock. It is incredibly hard to have a unified national conversation when you're speaking two different languages.
I can imagine.
There have been times when Belgium went without a formal government for over a year because the two sides just couldn't agree on a coalition.
That is wild. It's amazing the trains still run at all. But okay, let's talk about the thing that makes the world go round. Or in this case, the thing that stops it from turning. Factor number 3, economic problems.
The wallet argument. This is one of the most pragmatic drivers of devolution. It moves away from who are we and asks who is paying for this.
It's the classic maker versus taker debate. You see this in the source notes regarding Scotland and Catalonia. They look at their regional GDP, they look at what they send to the capital in taxes, and then they look at what comes back in services. And the math just doesn't add up for them.
Right. In the literature, this is often called the fiscal deficit argument.
Mm-hmm.
In Catalonia, for example, the sentiment isn't just we are rich, it's we are being held back.
Because they make so much money.
Catalonia is an industrial powerhouse. It generates a huge chunk of Spain's entire GDP through industry and tourism.
And their argument is that the central government in Madrid is taking that wealth and giving it to someone else.
Exactly. They argue that the central government is heavily redistributing that wealth to the more agrarian, less productive parts of Spain. So the wealthy region starts feeling like the cash cow for the rest of the country.
That's bound to cause resentment.
It does. They start thinking, wait a minute, we could actually survive and maybe even thrive much better if we were just alone.
So it's not strictly greed. It's a feeling that their economic engine is being stalled by the rest of the train.
Precisely. That profound economic confidence fuels the calls for independence. And to keep them in the fold, Spain has to transfer power. They offer fiscal autonomy, basically the government saying, okay, you can keep more of your tax revenue, just please don't leave the country.
And then you throw natural resources into the mix. The notes mention Scotland here.
Scotland is the perfect example of how physical resources change the entire equation. The modern argument for Scottish independence largely hinges on North Sea oil.
It's Scotland's oil. That was the phrase, right?
That was the exact slogan. They argue that the massive tax revenue from that oil should benefit Edinburgh, not London. When a region has a specific, highly valuable resource that the rest of the country lacks, that economic leverage becomes a massive centrifugal force.
Because they don't need the center anymore.
Right. They feel financially self-sufficient, which completely removes the fear of going it alone.
So we've got mountains blocking the capital, we've got distinct groups wanting their own flag, and we've got rich regions fiercely guarding their wallets. These are all, I don't want to say logical, but they are structural. They lead to tense debates in Parliament. But the source material takes a much darker turn for this next one.
It does. Because sometimes the central government simply refuses to listen to those arguments. Or the region decides that asking nicely just isn't working anymore.
And that leads us directly to factor 4, violence and extremes, specifically terrorism and ethnic cleansing.
This is where the friction of distance turns into actual fire. We move from political pressure to kinetic pressure.
Let's start with terrorism. On the surface, it seems counterintuitive. How does blowing things up lead to getting a regional parliament?
It's about attrition. Terrorism, in the specific context of devolution, is using violence to force political change. Groups use it to weaken the central authority's resolve.
So wear them down.
Exactly. If you make it costly enough in lives, in money, in daily security for the central government to rule you, they might just give you what you want to make it stop.
The make it stop strategy.
It is grim, but it has been effective historically. The source points to Northern Ireland and the IRA, the Irish Republican Army.
Right. They wanted independence from the UK to ultimately rejoin the Republic of Ireland.
And they used sustained violence to pursue it. The period known as the Troubles lasted for decades. Eventually, to bring peace to the region, the UK government engaged in devolution.
They signed an agreement.
Yes, in the 1990s, specifically with the Good Friday Agreement, they transferred significant powers to Northern Ireland, allowing them a much larger hand in their own affairs.
So the violence literally forced the government to loosen its grip.
It did. You see a similar dynamic noted in the Basque region with the group ETA. Violence was the lever used to pry power away from the center.
But then you have the darker side of this extreme factor, ethnic cleansing. This isn't rebels fighting the state. This is the state actively fighting the people.
Correct. This is the most extreme form of anti-devolution, and it almost always backfires. Ethnic cleansing is defined in the sources as state-led efforts to systematically eliminate a group.
Through imprisonment, expulsion, mass killing.
Yes.
The terrible logic being, if we get rid of the people who want to leave, the problem is solved.
That is the horrific logic, yes. But historically, it often accelerates the breakup of the country. The main case study the research provides here is Yugoslavia in the 1990s.
Under Slobodan Milosevic.
Yes. Yugoslavia was a complex mix of different ethnic groups that had been forced into one state after World War I. By the 1990s, those groups desperately wanted out. Milosevic, the Serbian leader, attempted to suppress those devolutionary pressures through genocide, particularly against Bosnians.
But it didn't work. It didn't hold the country together.
It did the exact opposite. It caused an utter internal collapse and triggered international intervention. Yugoslavia didn't just devolve, it completely shattered.
It did totally new countries.
Right. It fragmented into new states like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and others. The attempt by the center to force unity through extreme violence ended up destroying the state completely.
That is a very heavy lesson. You really cannot kill your way to unity.
No, you absolutely cannot.
There's one last factor in our stack. It's a word I have to admit I hadn't heard much before prepping for this deep dive. Irredentism.
It is a fascinating concept. The term irredentism actually comes from the Italian word irredento, which means unredeemed.
Unredeemed. That's a very poetic way to say we want our land back. But how does this actually fit into devolution? Because usually we're talking about a region wanting to break free on its own. This sounds like a region wanting to break free to join someone else entirely.
And that is the critical distinction. Think of it as a tug of war again. Usually the region is just pulling away from the center. In irredentism, a neighboring country reaches across the border, grabs the rope, and starts pulling too.
So it's an external force adding to the pressure.
Exactly. It describes a movement to reunite a culturally unified people who happen to be divided by international borders. It's all about reclaiming territory and people based on shared ethnic ties.
The idea that those people over there are actually us.
Right. The idea that they belong to our country, not the one they're currently in.
This feels highly relevant to recent history. The source points strictly to Crimea in 2014 for this one.
Yes, that is the primary example provided in the literature. In 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which was legally and internationally recognized as part of Ukraine.
And the justification they used wasn't just a basic land grab.
No, the justification presented was fundamentally irredentist. Russia claimed that the majority of citizens living in Crimea were ethnically Russian.
They argued they were protecting them.
They argued these people organically belonged to the motherland and required protection from the state they were currently in.
So from the perspective of the state losing the territory in this case, Ukraine, this is an incredibly intense devolutionary pressure.
Massive. It challenges the sovereignty of the central government in the most direct, aggressive way possible. It essentially uses ethnicity as a wedge to rip a piece of the state away.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today, literally and figuratively. We've got mountains blocking the capital, distinct tribes wanting their own flag, rich regions wanting to keep their cash, violent extremes, and neighboring countries trying to reclaim their people.
It is a complex cocktail, and what's truly fascinating, and this is where we synthesize all of this, is that these factors almost never happen in a vacuum. They constantly overlap.
Right. Like we said earlier, the Basques had the mountains for geography and the language for identity and the violence for terrorism.
And Catalonia has the distinct ethnicity combined with the powerful economics. When you start stacking these factors on top of each other, the pressure on the central state becomes absolutely overwhelming. That's when the map lines really start to blur.
So let's zoom out for a second. What is the big takeaway for you listening to this? Why does this matter beyond just passing a high school geography quiz?
I think the biggest takeaway from all these sources is that devolution is simply the process of the map adjusting to the reality of the people living on it. We try to draw these straight, neat lines and call them permanent countries, but human beings are inherently
We
messy.
have different languages, different gods, different economies.
Exactly. Devolution is a safety valve for all of that. It's a structural solution to human pressure.
But it's a solution that fundamentally changes the nature of the state itself.
It does. It acknowledges that the state isn't a monolith. It's an ongoing negotiation. Every single day, a country has to actively justify its existence to its own people.
And sometimes that negotiation ends with a handshake and some car keys, and sometimes it ends with a very messy breakup.
Precisely.
Before we let everyone go, I know you always have one last thing simmering in your brain.
hmm
What is the provocative thought for the road today?
Well, looking at all these factors, the economic disparity, the ethnic pride, the friction of distance, it actually seems like all of them are increasing in our modern, hyper-connected world, not decreasing.
Interesting. So what does that mean?
So here's the question you have to ask yourself. If these devolutionary pressures continue to rise globally, what is the actual future of the nation state?
Where does it end?
Are we heading toward a future map that looks like a shattered mirror? A world of 500 or maybe 1,000 smaller hyper-local microstates? Or will central governments find completely new, innovative ways to maintain unity in the face of all this fragmentation?
A world of 1,000 microstates. That would make geography class a total nightmare for high schoolers. Imagine having to memorize 500 capital cities.
It certainly would be a challenge.
Well, on that terrifying note for students everywhere, we are going to wrap it up. Thanks for diving deep with us today into the cracks in the map.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.